Hi, before we begin the episode, we have a tiny request. Most of you have been listening to Daybreak for a while now, but turns out you have not rated us yet. So, could you please spare a moment to drop us a rating or a review on whatever streaming platform you prefer, Spotify or Apple? It really helps us. And now, on to the episode, and thank you in advance.
Sir, so I have a big question to start with. I want to know if hypothetically today you had to launch a national airline, what would it look like and what would you do differently?
Yeah, obviously, the circumstances today, the time today is different from what it was. It, it was a huge success then because we were the first low cost airline and nobody believed it's possible.
That was Captain GR Gopinath. You may know about him, or maybe you don't. In case you don't, let me just put it this way. Every time you take a domestic flight in India and you don't have to break in FD to buy a ticket, you have him to thank.
Okay, let me explain. Captain Gopinath introduced India to the concept of budget flying. Back in the early 2000s, 2003 to be specific, he launched Air Deccan. Now, this was India's first low-cost carrier, or LCC. Before that, only the rich and powerful could afford to fly. So planes basically looked like mini five-star hotels. You'd be waited on hand and foot, you'd have access to these really luxurious lounges, you'd get served gourmet food, the works. It was an all-out experience. And of course, it came with an outrageous price tag to match.
Until one fine day, a young serial entrepreneur from Karnataka who was retired from the Indian Army came along and decided, you know what, enough of this. Everybody should be able to fly. And it was this simple yet powerful idea of his that completely revolutionized flying in India.
So I had to fight with the government to get them to believe in my dream because the question was, how can they be a low cost airline? Because the aircraft costs the same, the fuel costs the same, the salary costs the same, and the pilots cost the same. So how can you have a low cost airline? So I just gave them a few concepts. I said it's like a Udupi hotel. People come in, eat your darshini, stand and eat and go. So it's similarly, it's not exactly the same kind of analogy. The aircraft as lands and immediately takes off, unloads and takes off. Unlike the conventional airlines where the aircraft lands but waits for passengers from the other airlines.
Air Deccan wrote the budget flying playbook in India. And it did some really, really crazy things, like selling thousands of flight tickets for the price of a mango bite toffee. 1 rupee tickets were their thing. I mean, Snigdha, could you even imagine something like that today?
It's crazy.
But that big, bold pitch is exactly what put Air Deccan on the map and eventually made it the third largest carrier in the country just 3 years after it was launched.
But here's the thing. Success is a double-edged sword. Because suddenly, everybody wanted to come in and copy-paste the Deccan playbook. Up until then, this was an industry dominated by a handful of players. Now, there were a bunch of newbies, all emboldened by Deccan's success. Go Air, SpiceJet, Jetlight, and of course, Indigo. So, less than 3 years after its launch, Air Deccan was no longer the only airline offering dirt cheap tickets.
Yeah, it was very tough because we had a huge lack of resources. We didn't have airport space.
Yeah.
We didn't have pilots. We didn't have engineers. And about 5 to 6 airlines came suddenly. But eventually, it's one of survival of the fittest. Yeah.
Unfortunately, the Air Deccan story ended less than 5 years after it started. Over the years, many of its competitors also had the same fate.
But if you cut to 2024, budget flying looks drastically different from what it was back then. There's a very interesting scenario playing out right now. India is home to the third largest domestic aviation market by volume. Domestic passenger numbers have more than doubled in the last decade. More airports are being built across the country than ever before. On the surface, things are looking better than ever. But in many ways, we are back to square one. One single airline dominates 60% of the market share here in India, and no prizes for guessing which one it is.
I'm sure you know we're talking about Indigo. The remaining 40% is split between everyone else. But we all know what happens when one company starts monopolizing an industry. The customer tends to suffer. And in this case, too, we are seeing that play out in different ways. Delays, cancellations, and just a generally uncomfortable experience overall. And there's the fact that flying, might I mention, isn't even that cheap anymore.
Budget flying seems to be drifting further and further away from the original no frills model, the Udupi restaurant model, so to speak. But if everything is going right behind the scenes, airlines are expanding their fleets like never before, a record number of people are traveling, then why is the flying experience getting so bad? Or is it? Hello and welcome to yet another special episode of Daybreak. I'm Snigdha.
And I'm Rahil, and every week, Snigdha and I come together to talk about something in business and tech that interests the both of us.
And it won't just be us. Depending on what we're talking about, we will be joined by some really interesting people on the podcast.
In this episode, we speak to Captain Gopinath about how budget flying works and what today's airlines are getting wrong. And this episode is special for another reason. We spoke to some of our Daybreak listeners who also happen to be frequent flyers. We wanted to know what matters more to them, service or price. The answers are pretty interesting. So stay tuned.
Rahil and I had a very eventful Tuesday afternoon this week. We went to the Jakur Aerodrome here in Bangalore along with our sound engineer Raji. So, this is a place which is basically like a mini airport about 20 kilometers away from the main Kempegowda International Airport. These days, it's mainly used for flight training, and it is also where a lot of companies keep their charter planes. One of those companies is Deccan Charters.
Okay, so picture this. The three of us pull up to the aerodrome. It's an unusually warm day. We're lugging all of this heavy equipment with us, mics, stands, the works. And there isn't a plane in sight. There's just a lot of barren land and some slightly overgrown patches of grass. There are a couple hangars here and there. And then tucked away in a corner is the Deccan Charters office and their own personal hangar, where we are happy to report we actually did see some pretty nifty helicopters. But we knew very little about said helicopters, so we oohed and ahed for a little bit, and then we continued on our mission to meet Captain Gopinath and to ask him what happened to budget flying.
But this is Daybreak. So, we were not just going to ask him the straightforward question. We wanted to get the real picture, so we framed the question a little bit differently.
So that actually brings you back to that question I started with. I was really excited to hear your perspective on this. But if you were launching a national airline once again today, what would it look like and what would you do differently?
One quick disclaimer before we begin. This episode, as we mentioned earlier, was not recorded in our usual studio settings. So despite all our best efforts, especially Rajiv's, you may notice that the audio quality is not usually what it is. Please do bear with us. Okay, so now that's out of the way, back to Captain Gopinath.
I think we need to, today the challenges are a little different. My challenges are different. I hardly had any funds, so nobody believed in my dream. So I cobbled together a small amount of 5 crores. I started the airline. Then once it started succeed, then people, found that it was a great idea and people then put money. Then I raised a lot of money as equity and gave them shares. Today, you've got a huge network of 2 airlines. So there are only 2 airlines and the third one is limping. This is SpiceJet, which is recovers and falls again, recovers and falls again.
The 2 airlines Captain Gopinath is talking about are Indigo and Air India. By the way, when we say Air India, we mean all the 4 airlines owned by Tata. So Air India, Air Asia, Air India Express, and of course, Vistara. In third place is SpiceJet, which, like Captain Gopinath mentioned, is struggling to stay in the game. There's also, of course, Akasha Air, but it is still nowhere close to the other three. And that's it.
India should have had at least about 20 airlines for this country's size, like in Europe, right?
Yeah.
We don't have that. So there's a big opportunity.
For
But-
another
but-
budget airline, though, sir?
For a budget airline, there's no
Yeah.
opportunity for full service.
Yeah.
There's no opportunity for full service because budget airline has got efficiency, it's
Yeah.
got new aircrafts. The full service also has got new aircraft. In fact, the full service has got older aircrafts. So why would anybody say I'll sit in the economy of Air India and pay more instead of just because I'm going to get some free food? Nobody going to sit in. First thing you see is what are the price.
Yeah.
If the price here is 500 rupees cheaper, you go into that. So right now, Indigo is making money. There's a huge network, and also when you start an airline, those people also put a flight next to you, which they also did in my time. And if they've got 500 or 2,000 flights, they'll put, you've got only 10 flights, they'll put 10 flights just before you so that they'll get it very cheap. So that your your aircraft goes empty.
So, but that's what confounds me, right? Like, again, like a full service airline is not a viable option, which I understand. But as someone like an outsider, of course, I'm just assuming if you go in as a brand new LCC, then isn't it just a race to the bottom? Because someone will always be able to undercut your price.
Yeah, not someone. The established airlines, because
Yeah.
in America there is what is known as a predatory pricing law. So similarly here now that problem is there. So that's the reason I said there is a different challenge now than the one that I had, because it's difficult to get also funding now because people feel that how are you going to succeed? Like you're asking. When then they didn't put funding because they said how is he going to succeed? There's no internet. You can't do low cost airline without internet. And that model was not there in India. It will not work. Everybody says it will work in America, but it will not work here. But an entrepreneur always comes with an idea which beats the market.
Right.
So whoso is going to come now, because right now we do not have that kind of Ryanair in India, ultra cost low airline. We do not have where they give tickets at zero cost.
Do you think that's a viable business model in a country like
It's
ours?
worked everywhere, right? Because they put it at zero, but not all tickets are at zero. They'll put about 5 tickets on every flight at zero.
So
Only
it's-
5.
So it's like return of the 1
Because it
rupee.
will stimulate the market.
Yeah.
Right? And then he makes money on the other goods that he sells. Then you go at 1 rupee, but come back at 2,000 rupees. So you make an average of 1,000. So that's how you succeed.
Okay, so one thing is pretty clear. LCC is the way to go. Captain Gopinath basically said it has to be a budget airline or nothing. Now, he mentioned the poster child of budget airlines, Ryanair. I'm sure you've heard of this infamous Irish airline. It's not your average budget airline, it's an ultra budget airline with a bit of a reputation thanks to its controversial CEO, Michael O'Leary.
Did you really want to charge to use toilets on Ryanair planes? Yes or no?
Yes, but not because I want the money. We'll give the money away to charity. I want to get rid of we have 3 toilets. If I can get rid of the 2 toilets at the back of the planes, I can add 6 extra seats. With 6 extra seats, I can lower everybody's airfare by another 5% all year round.
Yep, that's the guy. He's also the person who once said that selling standing tickets on flights would be a good idea. But the thing is, controversial or not, Ryanair has figured out the budget flying business model. And it's quite simple. You sell dirt cheap tickets, sometimes practically for free. But you also cram as many seats into the plane as possible so it is always running at full capacity. And then you charge for everything else. Snacks, extra legroom, carry-on baggage, the works. At some point, he even said he might charge for breathing on the plane.
When Ryanair came, he was so successful. He said, I'm not interested in giving you good service. I'm not in the service business. Even I said it sometime when Malia came. I said, we are not in the fashion business to give you fancy air hostesses. We're not giving you gourmet, give you gourmet food. We are here in transportation. We'll take you from point A to point B on time with your bags. Rest everything is we are not focusing on, except our smile is free. So we were focusing on service. But now, because when the airline is successful in the low cost airline, because they're so much focusing on the bottom line to grow, they lose their customer focus. They think that because it's lowest fare, the customer will love it. But another airline also gives low fare but gives good service. They'll switch there. But unfortunately, not easy to give that kind of efficiency as in Ryanair. Ryanair has got away by giving bad service, but he's so efficient and so simple that he has kept everybody. People, they don't care. They curse, but they go.
Okay, that may not make for the most comfortable flying experience, but it is the only way for an airline company to turn a profit. But like Captain Gopinath said, no one has been able to crack efficiency the way that Ryanair has. The only way you can afford to sell a few hundred or even 1,001 rupee tickets is by ensuring that the plane is running at full capacity. Because otherwise, breaking even when you're factoring in the cost of things like jet fuel and a bunch of other overheads is just impossible.
And then the next big challenge is figuring out the routes. How many routes can your airline cover? How many cities and towns can it possibly connect? Back in the day, Air Deccan managed to pull off something pretty revolutionary. It connected small 2-tier and 3-tier towns to big cities. So it would use these 70, 80-seater planes, usually ATRs, for regional routes and bigger Airbuses that could accommodate well over 100 passengers for larger cities with more demand.
And when we were talking about, strategy, right, in the early years of Deccan, what you did for tier 2 and tier 3 cities, and then I know you went on to also run a regional airline. Do you think you take a similar approach this time as well, or would you have to rethink?
Yeah, there are two ways. One is you can start with full service airlines, then add the ATR like what Indigo did. The other one you start with that, it's because you require then low investment. But when you start with ATRs, you have to go to routes. You have to be very smart, because if they put an Airbus with the ATR, and if Airbus gets 100% occupancy and the ATR gets 100% occupancy of, let's say, 42 passengers, 48 passengers, and or 72 passengers in ATR, and Airbus is, let's say, 190 or whatever, then the Airbus is cheaper. On a Bangalore Chennai, if you have 180 passengers and so on, their cost per seat is cheaper. So you will not be able to beat them. But but it has other advantages. You get into the ATR fast, you get out of it fast. So you have to choose alternate routes or timing, because there's so many airports which are not connected. So you have to choose those areas and then start. But of course, that danger is there that they'll come. That's what they did to me. But your costs are so low that they will withdraw usually. So you have to get, the key is to get low cost in operations so that you can give low fares. And innovation in all your technology, innovation in pricing, innovation in your revenue management.
Okay, recap time. Here's what Captain Gopinath's hypothetical new national airline would look like. Air Deccan 2.0, if I may. First and foremost, it would be a low-cost carrier. Captain Gopinath was clear about one thing. Budget is the only way to go. Then, a la Ryanair, you drop ticket prices while also making sure that you are maximizing the number of passengers you can accommodate on the flight. More passengers, the cheaper each seat cost is for the airline. Then you charge for every single add-on, you connect a bunch of small towns with big cities, and there you have it, the perfect no-frills budget airline.
But how do passengers, all of us, feel about it? And is this what we really want? We asked you guys, Daybreak listeners. So stay tuned. Conventional wisdom around egg freezing often writes it off as yet another scammy product of the booming fertility industry. But as to women in our early 30s and late 20s, we know things are not that straightforward. But why shouldn't we be able to hack the system and prolong our fertility?
We have a hypothesis. We believe that women opting to freeze their eggs are career-oriented and in their 30s. We also believe that most people who don't want to go through with freezing their eggs opt out of the procedure because it is just too expensive.
In an upcoming episode of Daybreak, we want to dive into the real-world complexities that drive a lot of women to opt for procedures like egg freezing. We want to hear from you. do you agree with our hypothesis?
This survey isn't just for women who have undergone the procedure, it's also for those of you who have considered it at some point in your life. We want to glean from all your experiences and why you make the decisions you make.
And of course, it goes without saying that the results of this survey are completely anonymous and confidential. We will reach out to you for more details only with your explicit consent.
The link to the survey will be in the show notes of this episode. It'll only take a couple of minutes to fill in. And now, back to the episode. Welcome back. If you are a regular Daybreak listener, you may recall that we asked you, our listeners, about your flying experience. And I'm happy to report that quite a few of you actually reached out to us. 20 people wrote to us. Now, these are people who take multiple flights every month. Some of these people even fly a couple times every week. I mean, I'm honestly just exhausted thinking about it. But it would be fair to say that they are all pro flyers. Now, a little while ago, we spoke to Captain Gopinath and we got a sense of the ideal business model for a budget airline. But we want to understand what people really want. And by people, I mean us. You know, people actually taking these flights. What matters more to us? Good service or cheap tickets?
So, we sent out a bunch of questions to everybody who responded to us on our WhatsApp number. And then we got to have longer conversations with 4 of them. A big shout out to Prachi, Yash, Shivhare and Antriksh for giving us their time. They're all working professionals residing in different parts of the country in different lines of work. Rahil, can you walk us through the questions that we asked them and what was the objective of all this?
So the objective was to understand what frequent flyers want from their flying experience. Of course, we wanted to know how often they fly. We also wanted to get a sense of which airline they generally opt for. And then we went in and asked what matters more to them when it comes to air travel. Price or comfort. Straight off the bat, the general consensus is that the flying experience just isn't that much fun anymore for a variety of reasons.
I appreciate the flying experience that comes with Vistara or Air India. If it's Indigo, it's mostly bad. Hardly ever ugly, but never good as well.
If you ask me about the flight experience, I would have to say that it has been somewhat disappointing due to the excessive crowds at the entry and the security areas of the airport.
Flying domestically has been a true pain of late. I've been outside the country for about 4 months now, so I can't speak to the extremely recent times, but right before I left, I took several flights to tend to work and personal commitments, and most of them were delayed.
For example, recently I went to Prayagraj and I paid a 400 rupee for a pre-booked local veg meal, and I was expecting a small meal. But in flight I received 2 small vada paos wrapped in a plastic, which was cold and unappetizing basically.
So, yes, all 4 listeners had similar concerns. Things just seem to be a lot more chaotic these days. Indigo, Air India, Vistara were the most popular choices for all 4 of them, and that did not come as a surprise. But here is where things get interesting. When it comes to the price or comfort question, we got some surprising answers. We were expecting people to straight up say price, but multiple people said it depends on the duration of the flight. For longer domestic flights, they do prefer more comfortable carriers. And 3 out of the 4 listeners we spoke to said they enjoyed the overall flying experience Vistara had to offer.
But they were also aware of the fact that their days traveling on board Vistara flights were numbered. Right? The airline is in the middle of a merger with Air India, so it will technically cease to exist by sometime next month. And with that, a duopoly will be solidified. We will have Indigo with its mammoth, over 60% market share. And then we will have Air India, which has swallowed up a bunch of the other competitors and returned to relevance.
Right. Now, I know Captain Gopinath is not a big believer in the full-service airline model, and I do see his point, but clearly there is a demand for it, right? And I'm not just saying this based on the conversations that we've had with our listeners. I mean, even Indigo has announced recently that it will be launching business class on select routes.
Right, and you do have a point there, Snigdha, because this isn't just happening in India. Globally, we are seeing a bunch of budget airlines starting to offer certain premium upsells. It's sort of like Economy Plus, Okay, so Spirit, Southwest, which are some of the biggest airlines in the West, are all going down that route. They'll offer somewhat of a tiered model, so you can opt for no frills, or you can cough up some extra cash and get a few luxuries like food and priority boarding. In some senses, it does make sense to premiumize, right? Especially because per capita income and people's discretionary spending has been increasing considerably over the years. It's pretty well documented. With that, there's also, of course, been a considerable increase in air travel too, right? There are far more people traveling by planes. The idea, of course, here is to squeeze as much money out of you as possible. So it's basically a really far cry from the 1 rupee ticket days.
Right, which is also why, the likes of Air India and Indigo, they're betting big on future growth and they're willing to take risks like premiumization because they believe it will pay off in the long run. They're also adding up to their fleets like never before. Indigo has ordered 500 new planes. Air India, under its new Tata management, has ordered about 470. Even relatively new airlines like Akasa have close to 60 planes on order. And they've also been expanding their routes even beyond India.
Okay, but the thing is, there's a reason most full-service airlines crash and burn. Metaphorically speaking, of course.
Thank God.
It comes back to the fact that this is a business that's built on high volumes and low margins, right? Captain Gopinath spoke about that a little while ago too. Basically, airlines seek to gain a lot more from doing things like Ryanair, cramming in as many seats as possible to bring down the cost per seat, right? Because there are just so many variables airlines have to consider. Things like jet fuel costs, manpower costs, geopolitical tensions. Anything could send them over the edge, right? I mean, Air Deccan is the ultimate example of how things can suddenly go south.
So I almost succeeded. It was not that easy. And but when the oil prices went up by 4 times, and when pilot salaries, which we started at 1 lakh, went to 6 lakhs, and the engineer salary, which we started at 25,000, went to something like 3 lakhs, 4 lakhs. Even every price went up. We were not able to give that kind of a ticket at that time. And so therefore, there was a glut of airlines. It was a combined combination of this and that. And so my calculations did not prove right because I was a bit ahead of time.
So it is fair to say now that we are kind of making our way into the second chapter of budget flying in India. And this time around, it does not seem to fit perfectly into the Udupi restaurant mold, nor does it fit into the 5-star mold. It seems to be somewhere in the middle. And airlines in India, at least for now, will have to tread the fine line between both. But one part of the story that has stood the test of time since the Air Deccan days is this. It is survival of the fittest.
Every day at the end of the Daybreak episode, you've been listening to Snigdha or me telling you about the Ken and why you should subscribe to access all our premium offerings. These include long-form stories, newsletters, and of course, podcasts. Today is the day we show you what it's like. The Ken's business team has carefully designed a free curated experience for you to explore for an entire month before you make the plunge. It's to give you a glimpse of what you've been paying for should you choose to subscribe to us. Every day for 30 days, you get to enjoy one subscriber-exclusive story handpicked and unlocked for you. You also get a subscription to our most read daily newsletter, The Spotlight, which tells you all the things we have published on a particular day. So if you've been wondering what the Ken is all about and why our subscribers love us, here is your chance to find out. All you have to do is sign up with your email and start reading. Just log on to the-ken/trial.
This episode was scripted and produced by Rahil Philippos and edited by Rajiv CN. Do tell us what you thought of it. Send us a text on our WhatsApp number. It is 89711083779. Also, don't forget to rate us.